Who were the mysterious mountain people who didn't fit into America's racial categories? Hidden in the Appalachian ridges lived families with copper skin, dark eyes, and European features, speaking English but claiming to be Portuguese. For centuries, they've been America's greatest genetic mystery, a people who shouldn't exist according to the country's black and white racial narrative. Modern DNA testing is finally revealing their shocking origins. In 1784, land surveyor John Sevier was mapping the Tennessee frontier when he encountered something that stopped him cold. High in the mountains, living in log cabins along remote ridges, were families unlike any he'd seen before. They had dark, copper-colored skin, straight black hair, and high cheekbones, but their facial features looked European. They spoke English with a strange accent, using words Sevier didn't recognize. When he asked about their origins, they claimed to be Portuguese, but they looked nothing like the Portuguese sailors Sevier had met in coastal ports. These mountain people had been living in Appalachia since before the American Revolution, yet no one knew where they came from. They weren't white in a legal sense, weren't black, weren't Indian. In a young America that was already dividing people into rigid racial categories, the Melungeons, as they called themselves, didn't fit anywhere. The name itself was a mystery. Melungeon. Where did it come from? Some claimed it derived from the French mélange, meaning mixture. Others said it came from an Afro-Portuguese term. Still others suggested Turkish or Arabic origins. Even the people themselves couldn't agree on what their name meant or where it came from. For over 2 centuries, the Melungeons remained enigmatic. They clustered in specific regions, primarily Newman's Ridge in eastern Tennessee, Snake Hollow in Virginia, and scattered communities in Kentucky and North Carolina. They kept to themselves, marrying within their communities, maintaining distinctive customs and foods that seemed neither European, African, nor Native American, but somehow all three. In 2004, the first comprehensive genetic study of Melungeon populations began. Dr. Kevin Jones at the University of Virginia collected DNA samples from 120 individuals whose families had been identified as Melungeon for generations. What emerged from the genetic analysis shocked researchers. The Melungeons weren't a simple triracial mixture as often claimed. They were something far more complex, carrying genetic signatures from at least 6 different continental populations, some originating from places that shouldn't have been possible given American colonial history. To understand the Melungeon mystery, we must understand how America's racial laws created populations that officially didn't exist. In the early United States, being legally white carried enormous privileges: voting rights, property ownership, legal testimony, education for children, freedom of movement. Being classified as free persons of color, the catch-all category for anyone not legally white, meant losing all these rights. The definition of white varied by state, but generally meant pure European ancestry. Any known African or sometimes Native American ancestry, no matter how distant, could disqualify someone from whiteness. This created an impossible situation for people of mixed ancestry. If they appeared ambiguous, they faced constant scrutiny, potential loss of rights, and social ostracism. The first documented tragedy struck Melungeon families in 1834, when Tennessee passed a new constitution. The law stated clearly, only free white persons could vote, own land, or testify in court. Suddenly, Melungeon families who had owned mountain farms for generations found themselves legally classified as free persons of color. They lost voting rights overnight. Their children were banned from public schools. Most devastatingly, some families lost land that had been in their possession for 50 years because they couldn't legally defend their ownership in court. The Vardy Collins case became legendary in Melungeon communities. Vardy was a war hero who fought in the War of 1812. In 1846, a white neighbor claimed Vardy's 300-acre farm belonged to him. When Vardy went to court, the judge ruled that as a person of color, Vardy couldn't testify in his own defense. He lost everything. His family was forced to move higher into the mountains, onto land so poor that no white person wanted it, land where farming was nearly impossible. This pattern repeated across Appalachia, as Melungeon families were pushed onto ridgetops where the soil was thin and survival difficult. They became isolated not by choice, but by legal and social pressure. This isolation had a strange dual effect. It preserved their distinctive culture and bloodlines, allowing genetic researchers centuries later to study a relatively unmixed population. But it also created severe genetic bottlenecks that would have serious medical consequences. Dr. Virginia DeMarce, who spent 40 years researching Melungeon genealogy, found that most of today's 200,000 Americans with Melungeon ancestry descend from just 15 original families. These families, The Collins, Gibson, Goins, Minor, Mullins, and others intermarried for centuries in their mountain communities. Church records from Newman's Ridge show the same surnames appearing generation after generation. A Gibson would marry a Collins, their daughter would marry a Mullins, and their son would marry another Gibson. This wasn't preference, it was survival. Marrying outside the community meant risking violence or legal persecution. But this endogamy had genetic consequences. Rare recessive disorders became common. Genetic diseases that should appear once in 10,000 births appeared in 1 in 100. Medical conditions that geneticists had barely documented elsewhere became regular occurrences in Melungeon families. For centuries, observers noted that Melungeons looked distinctive. But distinctive how? Descriptions varied wildly, revealing more about the observer's biases than objective reality. Some called them Portuguese-looking. Others insisted they appeared Turkish or Mediterranean. Still others claimed they had Native American features with European admixture. What everyone agreed on were certain unusual physical characteristics that appeared with high frequency in Melungeon populations. Many had what anthropologists call the Anatolian bump, a distinctive bony protrusion on the back of the skull common in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern populations, but rare in Europeans, Africans, or Native Americans. This feature appears in approximately 30 to 40% of people claiming Melungeon ancestry, far higher than in the general American population. Another distinctive feature was shovel-shaped incisors, a dental characteristic where the back surface of the front teeth is scooped out. This trait is nearly universal in East Asian and Native American populations, appearing in 90 to 100% of individuals. It's rare in Europeans, appearing in perhaps 10 to 20%, and uncommon in Africans. Melungeons showed shovel-shaped incisors at rates around 50 to 60%, suggesting significant Native American or Asian ancestry. Polydactyly, having extra fingers or toes, appeared in Melungeon families at rates far exceeding the general population. This genetic trait, caused by dominant mutations in several genes, normally appears in about 1 in 500 to 1,000 births. In some Melungeon family lines, particularly the Collins and Gibson families, rates reached 1 in 50 or even higher. The trait became so associated with Melungeons that having 6 fingers was sometimes used as evidence of Melungeon ancestry. Most intriguingly, Melungeons suffered from diseases virtually unknown in other American populations. Familial Mediterranean fever, a genetic autoinflammatory disease caused by mutations in the MEFV gene, is common in populations from the Mediterranean basin, particularly Sephardic Jews, Armenians, Turks, and Arabs. It's extremely rare in Northern Europeans and almost non-existent in Africans or Native Americans. Yet, familial Mediterranean fever appeared in Melungeon populations at rates approaching those seen in Mediterranean populations. Behçet's disease, another autoinflammatory condition common along the ancient Silk Road from Turkey to Japan, appeared in Melungeon families. Sarcoidosis, normally more common in Africans and Northern Europeans, showed up frequently. Thalassemia, a blood disorder common in Mediterranean populations, appeared at elevated rates. The disease profile of Melungeons suggested ancestry from regions far beyond the usual sources of American colonial populations. Even more mysterious were cultural practices that seemed out of place in Appalachian America. Melungeon families prepared foods that resembled Mediterranean and Middle Eastern dishes. They used distinctive folk remedies that matched neither European, African, nor Native American traditions. They told stories containing motifs that folklorists recognized from Turkish and Arabic oral traditions. Their quilting patterns resembled designs from Anatolia and the Caucasus. When Dr. Kevin Jones launched the Melungeon DNA Project in 2002, he expected to find a straightforward triracial mixture, European, African, and Native American ancestry in various proportions. Most researchers assumed Melungeons were descendants of escaped slaves, poor whites, and Cherokee or other southeastern Indians who had intermixed on the frontier. The actual results shocked everyone. The Y chromosome data, tracing paternal lineages, showed extraordinary diversity. Approximately 30% of Melungeon men carried haplogroup R1b, common in Western Europe, particularly among Celtic populations from Ireland, Scotland, and Iberia. Another 25% carried haplogroup E, which originated in Africa. About 15% had haplogroup J, found mainly in the Middle East, Mediterranean, and Caucasus. 10% carried haplogroup Q, marking Native American ancestry. The remaining 20% was a mix of other lineages from Central Asia, India, and Eastern Europe. This wasn't just a simple tri-racial mix. The diversity suggested Melungeon ancestry included people from at least 6 different continental regions, combined in ways that shouldn't have been possible given standard narratives of American colonial history. The mitochondrial DNA, tracing maternal lineages, proved equally diverse. European haplogroups like H and U were common, as expected, but so were African haplogroups L1, L2, and L3. Native American haplogroups A, B, C, and D appeared in about 15% of samples, but the real surprises were haplogroups M and N, typically found in South Asia, and various subclades common in the Middle East and Mediterranean. Dr. Jones compared Melungeon genetic profiles to other American populations. No other group showed this level of diversity. Even highly mixed populations like Louisiana Creoles or Brazilian Pardos had more predictable patterns. The Melungeons were unique. But how did people from Europe, Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Middle East all end up in the Appalachian Mountains? The answer required historical detective work. Researcher Paul Heinig spent decades combing through colonial records in Virginia and North Carolina. He found something remarkable that standard history books had missed. In the 1600s and early 1700s, before strict racial laws codified who could marry whom, the American colonies were more fluid than anyone imagined. Colonial records revealed Portuguese and Spanish sailors who jumped ship in Virginia ports, seeking freedom from harsh conditions aboard merchant vessels. Turkish and North African galley slaves who escaped from Spanish ships that stopped in American ports. Free African craftsmen who worked alongside European indentured servants. Native Americans who traded and intermarried with all these groups. Before America became obsessed with racial purity, people mixed freely. One documented case involves John Collins, recorded in 1640s Virginia. He's listed as a Turk who married a Native American woman. Their children married into families of Portuguese sailors and free African landowners. By 1750, their descendants were established farmers in frontier regions that would become Tennessee and Kentucky. Another family line traces to Emmanuel Drigas, also called Portuguese Emmanuel, who appeared in Virginia in 1643. Records describe him as a black man from Portugal, or possibly a Portuguese-speaking African. He married a Native American woman, and their descendants intermarried with other mixed families. By the time these families reached Appalachian regions in the early 1700s, they represented a genetic mixture accumulated over several generations. Dr. Tim Hashaw's research identified at least 50 such mixed families in colonial Virginia and North Carolina, who later became identified as Melungeon. They shared certain characteristics. They were free people of color who owned land. They practiced trades like blacksmithing and carpentry, and they moved to the frontier when racial laws tightened in coastal regions, seeking places where authorities cared less about racial classification and more about whether you could farm and defend yourself. The genetic evidence supports this colonial mixing theory perfectly. Dr. Roberta Estes, analyzing Melungeon DNA in detail, found something fascinating. The genetic signatures weren't recent. They dated back 300 to 400 years, exactly matching the colonial period. The mixing happened in coastal Virginia and the Carolinas in the 1600s and early 1700s, before families moved into the mountains. Even more interesting, the Middle Eastern and North African DNA showed specific patterns. It wasn't generalized Mediterranean. It was specifically from regions that provided galley slaves to Spanish and Portuguese ships, coastal Algeria, Tunisia, Western Turkey, places where Christian Europeans would have raided for Muslim slaves who ended up in the Americas. The genetic signatures match historical records of Moorish and Turkish slaves appearing in colonial ports. Perhaps the most compelling evidence for Melungeon uniqueness comes from rare genetic markers that exist in almost no other populations. Dr. Janet Crane's research found several Melungeon family lines carry mitochondrial mutations that exist in only 0.01% of the world population. This mutation is found in exactly 3 places: isolated villages in northern Portugal, the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, and Melungeon communities in Appalachia. This suggests that some Melungeon ancestors came from very specific places and maintained their genetic distinctiveness through centuries of relative isolation. It's like finding a genetic time capsule. These rare variants survive because Melungeon communities practiced endogamy, marrying within their group, which preserved genetic signatures that would have been diluted to invisibility in more outbred populations. Another unique signature involves the beta-globin gene, which affects hemoglobin production. Certain mutations in this gene cause thalassemia, a blood disorder common in Mediterranean populations adapted to malaria-endemic regions. Specific thalassemia mutations appear in Melungeons at frequencies matching populations from Cyprus, southern Italy, and the eastern Mediterranean. These mutations are virtually absent in Northern European populations and rare in Africans and Native Americans. The distribution of lactose tolerance variants also tells a story. Most humans lose the ability to digest milk after weaning. Populations with long histories of dairy farming, particularly Northern Europeans and some East Africans, evolved genetic variants allowing adults to digest lactose. Melungeons show a specific pattern. They have European lactose tolerance variants at rates lower than pure European populations, but higher than pure African or Native American populations, consistent with mixed ancestry where some ancestors had dairy farming traditions and others didn't. Even more intriguing are genetic variants affecting drug metabolism. The CYP2D6 gene, which metabolizes many common medications, has dozens of variants affecting enzyme activity. Melungeons show a mixture of European, African, and Asian variants at frequencies that don't match any other American population. This has practical medical implications. Some Melungeons metabolize medications like codeine or antidepressants at rates quite different from typical Americans, requiring adjusted dosing. Disease genetics provides additional evidence. The MEFV gene mutations causing familial Mediterranean fever appear in Melungeons at high rates. The specific mutations found are those common in Sephardic Jews, Turks, and North African populations, not the variants occasionally found in other groups. This strongly suggests direct ancestry from Mediterranean populations rather than coincidental mutations. The Melungeons themselves told consistent stories about their origins, but mainstream historians dismiss these stories as myth or fabrication. Melungeon families claimed to be descendants of Portuguese sailors shipwrecked on the Carolina coast. Others said they were Turkish slaves who escaped from Spanish ships. Still others claimed descent from the lost colony of Roanoke. For centuries, these origin stories were treated as fantasy. Portuguese sailors in Appalachia? Turkish slaves in Tennessee? It seemed absurd. But DNA evidence has forced a reconsideration. The genetics show these stories, dismissed as myth, contain kernels of truth. Historical records, long overlooked, support Melungeon accounts. Spanish and Portuguese ships did stop at Carolina ports in the 1600s. They did carry Turkish, Moorish, and North African galley slaves. Records document slaves escaping and disappearing into the interior. Some Portuguese vessels were indeed shipwrecked on the Carolina coast, with survivors settling among coastal populations. The lost colony theory has less genetic support. The Roanoke colonists who disappeared in 1590 left no clear genetic trace in Melungeon populations. But the story may preserve memory of early English-speaking mixed populations that predated later settlers, populations that included Roanoke descendants along with other groups. What Melungeons consistently maintained, and what genetics now confirms, is that they're not simply the offspring of runaway slaves and Indians, the derogatory explanation often given by white neighbors. They have diverse ancestry, including Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, Iberian, African, Native American, and British sources, combined in colonial times before moving into the mountains. Faced with racial laws that threatened to strip them of all rights, Melungeon families developed sophisticated survival strategies. Chief among these was ethnic shifting, the ability to change their racial identity depending on circumstances and location. A Melungeon man might be listed as Portuguese when applying for a marriage license, claiming to be white enough to marry a European woman. He might be classified as Indian when avoiding the draft during wars. He might pass as white when trying to vote or testify in court. Census records show the same families classified differently from decade to decade. The 1830 census might list them as free-colored. By 1840, they're mulatto. In 1850, they become Indian. By 1860, if they've moved to a new county, they might successfully pass as white. This wasn't deception in the moral sense. It was survival in a system designed to oppress anyone who didn't fit neat racial categories. Some Melungeon families successfully passed into white society. They changed their surnames, moved away from known Melungeon communities, and never spoke of their origins. Their descendants today often don't know their Melungeon ancestry. Only DNA testing reveals it, showing genetic markers that couldn't come from pure European ancestry. Others accepted classification as free-colored and built lives within those constraints. They paid triple the taxes of whites in Tennessee. They needed special permits to own guns or dogs in Virginia. They couldn't testify against whites in North Carolina, making them easy targets for theft and violence. Yet they survived, maintaining communities and culture against enormous pressure. The consequences of being classified as non-white were severe and concrete. In Tennessee, free people of color paid 3 times the property tax of whites, making economic success nearly impossible. In Virginia, they couldn't own firearms or dogs without special permits, making hunting a crucial food source. difficult. In North Carolina, they couldn't testify in court against whites, leaving them vulnerable to cheating and violence with no legal recourse. Education was perhaps the cruelest exclusion. Melungeon children were barred from white schools as colored children, but were unwelcome in black schools because they weren't considered black. Some communities created their own schools, but without tax support, they could rarely afford teachers or books. The illiteracy rate in Melungeon communities reached 90% by 1900. Generations grew up unable to read or write, trapped in poverty partly by this educational exclusion. If the 19th century was hard for Melungeons, the 20th century brought new horrors. The eugenics movement, claiming scientific authority, targeted Melungeons as examples of racial degeneracy. Arthur Estabrook from the Carnegie Institution studied Melungeon families like laboratory specimens. His 1926 report called them a dangerous element, prone to feeble-mindedness and criminality. This wasn't just academic prejudice, it had real consequences. Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924 defined anyone with even one drop of non-white blood as colored. Suddenly, Melungeons who had been passing as white for generations were exposed. Birth certificates were changed, marriages were invalidated, children were expelled from white schools. Walter Plecker, Virginia's Registrar of Vital Statistics, became obsessed with hunting down Melungeons. He kept lists of suspect surnames: Collins, Gibson, Goins, Minor, Mullins, Bolin, Ramey. He sent spies to mountain communities. He'd examine school children for signs of mixed ancestry, checking fingernails, examining hair texture, looking for the Melungeon bump on skulls. Anyone with suspicious features had their race reclassified. One heartbreaking case involved the Ramsey family of Wise County, Virginia. They had successfully integrated into white society with children in college and businesses in town. But in 1943, someone sent Plecker an anonymous letter claiming the Ramseys were Melungeon. Plecker changed their racial classification overnight. The children were expelled from college. The father lost his business contracts. The daughter's white fiancé broke off their engagement. The family fled to Ohio, changed their names, and never spoke of their origins again. This pattern repeated hundreds of times. Melungeon families scattered across the country, settling in cities where no one knew their history. They became white if they could pass, black if they couldn't, Mexican in the Southwest, Italian in the Northeast, anything but Melungeon. Parents refused to tell children about their heritage. Family photos were burned. Genealogical records were destroyed. A culture that had survived 200 years of mountain isolation was nearly erased in a single generation. But genetics don't lie. In the 1990s, a new generation started asking questions. Why did grandmother have such unusual features? Why were we never allowed to visit certain relatives? Why did Great-Aunt Martha always insist we were Portuguese when we looked nothing like the Portuguese kids at school? The internet changed everything. Melungeon descendants who thought they were alone found others with the same stories. Websites connected thousands of people searching for their roots. Then came consumer DNA testing. For $99, anyone could discover their genetic ancestry. Thousands of Americans who thought they were simply white or black suddenly discovered unexpected ethnicities in their results. They found Native American ancestry no one had mentioned. They found African ancestry in families that identified as white. They found Middle Eastern, Mediterranean, and South Asian ancestry that shouldn't exist according to family stories. Many found Melungeon ancestry. The specific combination of markers, the unusual geographic sources, the presence of rare variants, all pointed to Melungeon heritage. People whose grandparents had successfully hidden their origins found the truth written in their DNA. Dr. Roberta Esta's detailed analysis of modern Melungeon DNA reveals the lasting impact of centuries of isolation and endogamy. Certain genetic combinations appear only in Melungeon populations. They carry specific mutations that act like genetic fingerprints, marking descent from those original 15 founding families identified by Dr. DeMars. One such marker is a variation in the EDAR gene affecting hair thickness and sweat glands. It's found in only 3 populations worldwide: East Asians, Native Americans, and Melungeons. But Melungeons have a unique version suggesting their Asian ancestry came through a different route than typical Native Americans, possibly through ancient Silk Road connections to Mediterranean populations with Central Asian admixture. Another distinctive marker is a mutation in the LCT gene affecting lactose tolerance. Most adults worldwide are lactose intolerant, but Europeans evolved tolerance through cattle herding. Melungeons show a pattern where some family members have the European version, others the African version, and still others the Asian version, sometimes all in the same family. This complex pattern reflects their multiple ancestral sources. Doctors in Appalachian hospitals now routinely ask about Melungeon heritage when diagnosing certain conditions. Familial Mediterranean fever, thalassemia, and Behçet's disease, once considered rare in America, are now recognized as relatively common in Melungeon populations. Understanding the genetic basis helps doctors provide better treatment. Genetic counseling services have been established to help Melungeon families understand their disease risks and make informed reproductive decisions. The genetic rediscovery has sparked cultural revival. Melungeon descendants are reclaiming traditions their grandparents tried to forget. Foodways preserved in mountain hollers are being recognized as unique fusion cuisines, combining Mediterranean, African, Native American, and British elements. Dishes like leather breeches, dried green beans prepared in ways matching Turkish and Greek methods, are being celebrated rather than hidden. Language preservation efforts have documented hundreds of unique Melungeon words and phrases. Sioglin means crooked or leaning, possibly from an obsolete English dialect. Jasper means stranger or outsider. Neb means nosy or intrusive. These aren't just quaint dialect, they're linguistic fossils from the colonial mixing pot that created Melungeon culture. Modern Melungeon identity is complicated. Some embrace it fully, attending heritage festivals, joining genealogy groups, and proudly claiming their complex ancestry. Others, especially older generations, still refuse to acknowledge it. The fear runs deep. Grandparents remember when being identified as Melungeon meant losing everything. They protected their children and grandchildren by hiding the truth, and old habits of secrecy die hard. Young Melungeons face different challenges. College applications ask for race, but what box do you check when you're genetically everything? Some identify as multiracial, acknowledging the complexity of their heritage. Others choose based on appearance or family tradition. A few write Melungeon in the other category, reclaiming an identity their ancestors were forced to hide, transforming a term of shame into a badge of pride. The Melungeon genetic mystery has been largely solved. They're not a lost tribe of Israel, not Welsh explorers, not Phoenician sailors, all theories proposed at various times. They're the descendants of colonial-era mixing involving Portuguese and Spanish colonists, Turkish and North African slaves or sailors, free Africans, Native Americans, and British settlers who combined in the fluid racial environment of 17th-century coastal Virginia and the Carolinas before moving into the mountains. Their distinctive genetics result from this unusual mixture combined with centuries of endogamy in isolated mountain communities. The founder effect, where a small founding population's genetic quirks become amplified, explains why rare variants became common. The bottleneck effect, where populations shrink dramatically and lose genetic diversity, explains elevated rates of recessive disorders. What makes Melungeons scientifically important is that they represent a natural genetic experiment. They're a population whose origins can be traced, whose isolation can be documented, whose genetic evolution can be tracked. Studying Melungeons teaches geneticists about founder effects, admixture, selection, and drift in human populations. But Melungeons are more than scientific specimens. They're people whose ancestors survived against incredible odds. They maintained identity and community despite laws designed to erase them. They preserved culture through generations of persecution. They're finally receiving recognition not as curiosities or problems, but as a unique American ethnic group with their own history and heritage. The story of the Melungeons is ultimately a story about how race is a social construction, not a biological reality. Melungeons didn't fit America's racial categories because those categories were artificial and inadequate. Human populations don't come in 3 or 5 or any fixed number of types. They exist on continua, mixing constantly, creating populations of infinite variety. Melungeons are just one example of that infinite variety, rendered unusual only because America's racial laws created a false dichotomy they didn't fit. Understanding Melungeon genetics doesn't solve all mysteries. Questions remain. Why do some family lines carry certain markers while others don't? What other genetic surprises await discovery as DNA sequencing technology improves? How will climate change and modern migration affect this population going forward? Each answer creates new questions, ensuring the Melungeon story continues. Where conventional history saw mysterious mountain people who didn't fit, genetics sees a population whose very existence proves that human history is more complex, more intermixed, more beautiful than simple narratives allow. The hidden people of the mountains are hidden no longer. Their DNA has spoken, revealing not a mystery, but a mirror reflecting America's true diversity. the diversity authorities spent centuries trying to deny.